By early 1945, the German Reich was collapsing on all fronts. The once mighty military machine that had swept across Europe was now in full retreat. From the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces advanced relentlessly toward Berlin, to the Western Front, where Allied armies crossed the Rhine, German soldiers found themselves fighting a war they knew could not be won. The soldiers who had once marched in triumph through Paris and into the depths of Russia were now exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly demoralized. Many were no longer the seasoned veterans of the early war years, but rather hastily trained recruits, elderly men from the reserves, and even teenagers pressed into service as the manpower crisis deepened. For these men, the final months of the war became a struggle not just for territory or ideology, but for simple survival in an increasingly desperate situation. The transformation was stark and undeniable. Units that had once boasted full strength and modern equipment now operated at half capacity or less, relying on captured weapons and improvised repairs to keep fighting. Communications networks had largely collapsed, leaving commanders to make critical decisions based on outdated information or pure guesswork about enemy movements. Before we get into the details of their experiences, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these important historical stories. Wehrmacht soldiers during this period faced conditions that would have been unimaginable during the early, successful years of the war. Supply lines had broken down completely in many sectors. Food was scarce, ammunition was rationed, and medical supplies were virtually non-existent. One private, writing in his diary in March 1945, described the retreat from the Eastern Front: "We march day and night, always westward. The roads are clogged with refugees, women, children, old men, all fleeing the advancing front. We can barely distinguish between soldier and civilian anymore. Everyone is simply trying to survive." The German military leadership, once confident in their tactical superiority, was now making increasingly desperate decisions. Units were thrown into hopeless defensive positions, often with orders to fight to the last man. The concept of tactical withdrawal had been replaced by fanatical demands for resistance at any cost. Yet many ordinary soldiers began to question these orders, caught between their military oath and the obvious futility of continued resistance. The psychological burden of retreat was perhaps heaviest on the non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and corporals who had to maintain unit cohesion while privately harboring their own doubts. They witnessed firsthand the disintegration of military discipline as starving soldiers scavenged for food and warm clothing, sometimes from abandoned positions or civilian areas. Behind the statistics of military casualties lay individual human stories. These were young men who had grown up during the economic hardships of the 1920s and 1930s, who had been shaped by the propaganda and circumstances of their time. By 1945, many had been fighting for years, far from home, watching their comrades fall one by one. Letters home from this period reveal the psychological toll of the final months. Soldiers wrote of sleepless nights, constant fear, and the growing realization that they might never see their families again. Many expressed doubts about the war's purpose, though such sentiments had to be carefully concealed due to strict military discipline and the presence of political officers. The winter of 1944-45 was particularly brutal. German forces were often inadequately equipped for the harsh conditions, lacking proper winter clothing, heating fuel, and shelter. Frostbite and disease became as deadly as enemy fire. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, and wounded soldiers often had to be left behind during retreats. Many soldiers formed tight bonds with their immediate comrades, creating small support networks that became essential for psychological survival. These friendships often transcended previous social divisions, as aristocratic officers found themselves sharing meager rations with working-class privates, united only by their shared predicament and desire to see another day. As the military situation deteriorated, the traditional chain of command began to break down. Officers who had once commanded respect found themselves leading demoralized troops who increasingly questioned orders that seemed to serve no strategic purpose. Some officers attempted to surrender their units to Western Allied forces rather than face capture by Soviet troops, whom they feared would show less mercy. Others tried to organize orderly withdrawals to protect civilian populations. These decisions often put them in direct conflict with their superiors and the political leadership. The military police and field courts became increasingly active, attempting to maintain discipline through harsh punishments. Desertion rates climbed steadily, though exact figures remain disputed by historians. Many soldiers simply abandoned their posts and attempted to make their way home to protect their families. Regional commanders faced impossible choices: follow orders from Berlin that seemed disconnected from battlefield reality, or make local decisions that might save lives but constituted disobedience. The communication breakdown was so severe that some units fought on for days after local ceasefires had been arranged, simply because word had not reached them. Radio equipment was scarce and unreliable, and courier services had become extremely dangerous as Allied forces controlled most major roads and transportation networks. The Battle of Berlin, which began in April 1945, represented the final act for many German soldiers. The city's defenders included regular army troops, SS units, police, firefighters, and members of the civilian militia. Many were fighting not just for the regime, but for their homes and families who were trapped in the besieged city. Street fighting was particularly brutal and personal. Soldiers fought from house to house, often defending the very neighborhoods where they had grown up. The distinction between combatant and civilian became increasingly blurred as the battle raged through residential areas. Ammunition and supplies dwindled rapidly. Soldiers were reduced to fighting with makeshift weapons and whatever equipment they could salvage. Medical care was virtually non-existent, and the wounded often had to tend to themselves or rely on civilian volunteers. As the situation became hopeless, many units began to surrender or simply melt away. Others continued fighting, driven by a combination of duty, fear of punishment, and sometimes genuine belief in their cause. The sound of artillery had become so constant that many soldiers suffered from what would now be recognized as severe hearing damage and shell shock. Sleep became nearly impossible, and many troops survived on a combination of adrenaline, caffeine from ersatz coffee, and whatever stimulants could be obtained through medical channels or improvised means. The official surrender on May 8, 1945, came as a relief to many German soldiers, though it also marked the beginning of a new ordeal: captivity. Millions of German soldiers were taken prisoner by the various Allied powers, facing uncertain fates. Those captured by Western forces generally faced better conditions, though even these prison camps were overcrowded and undersupplied in the immediate aftermath of the war. Soldiers captured by Soviet forces faced much harsher treatment, with many not returning home for years, if at all. For the soldiers who survived the war's end, the psychological impact was profound. They returned to a Germany that had been completely transformed, physically destroyed, politically reorganized, and morally reckoning with the consequences of the war. Many struggled to reconcile their military service with the full knowledge of what the regime had done. The experience of these final months created lasting trauma that affected not just the soldiers themselves, but their families and communities for generations to come. The process of demobilization was chaotic and often traumatic in itself. Many soldiers had to make long journeys home on foot, through a landscape of destroyed infrastructure and suspicious civilian populations who often viewed returning soldiers with a mixture of relief and resentment, particularly in areas that had suffered under military occupation. The story of German soldiers in the war's final phase offers important lessons about the human cost of conflict and the breakdown of societies. These were ordinary individuals caught in extraordinary circumstances, making choices under extreme pressure that would define the rest of their lives. While we must never forget the crimes committed by the regime they served, we can also recognize the common humanity in their struggles for survival, their fears for their families, and their ultimate desire for the war to end. Their letters, diaries, and testimonies provide valuable insights into how wars truly end, not with grand gestures or political declarations, but with exhausted human beings finally laying down their arms. Understanding this history helps us comprehend not just what happened in those final months of 1945, but how societies can prevent such devastation in the future. The individual stories of these soldiers remind us that behind every historical statistic lies a human being, with hopes, fears, and the fundamental desire to survive and return home. Their experiences serve as a sobering reminder of war's ultimate futility and the importance of seeking peaceful solutions to international conflicts before they spiral beyond control. The documentary record left by these soldiers, their letters, diaries, and post-war testimonies, continues to be studied by historians and psychologists seeking to understand how ordinary individuals cope with extraordinary stress and moral complexity. These primary sources remain invaluable for understanding not just this specific historical moment, but the broader human experience of warfare and its aftermath.